everybody. Nelson? Oh, okay. Now the mic's on. My name is Hae Yoon. I'm the Government Affairs Director at the Vera Institute of Justice. And welcome back. And we're ready to go with our second panel. We are going to be talking about looking at alternatives to incarceration at each stage of the criminal justice process. I know the last panel talked about a different word, and we're going to stick with that word for purposes of this panel. So I am going to turn it over to our panelists to start their presentations, and we're going to start first with Janine Buck-Willison, who is a Senior Research Fellow at the Justice Policy Center at the Urban Institute.
Great, thank you so much. And I'm going to kick off the panel by providing a high-level overview of the array of alternatives to incarceration that are used across the U.S. and across key criminal justice decision points. So taking a very broad approach to this, looking at decision points spanning arrest through to post-disposition. And I'll do that by briefly highlighting the various decision points and opportunities at which to appropriately use an alternative to incarceration, highlighting some examples of common ATIs, as well as sharing some examples of innovative alternatives to incarceration mechanisms implemented by selected communities in the United States under the auspices of the MacArthur Foundation's Innovation Fund, which is an initiative that seeds criminal justice innovation and reform, specifically measures designed to reduce the over-reliance on jail through small implementation grants. And Urban is actually administering the Innovation Fund, which is part of the reason that I'm highlighting some of the work in these selected communities today. I think it's helpful just to very quickly step back and think and make sure we define what we mean by alternatives to incarceration. I'm defining this very broadly today. I think that's consistent with the panel and the symposium to really mean or discuss any option or alternative to custodial time. So the use of jail, prison, and again, taking this very broad approach, looking at where there are options to avoid the use of incarceration at arrest, all the way through to post-disposition. And I think it's important to also be considering for whom we're using appropriately alternatives to incarceration. So I'll highlight a few different mechanisms. I think it's also here just important to highlight a couple things in terms of understanding what alternatives to incarceration are designed to advance. They're designed to advance a number of different objectives, from increasing system efficiency to reducing system costs, as well as, I think, promoting equity in the system. We know that in this country we tend to hold people pre-trial based on their economic status or ability to pay. Alternatives to incarceration can be one way to try and reduce the reliance on fees and fines, as well as enhance outcomes for individuals by providing greater flexibility for some criminal justice actors in terms of being able to respond accordingly to the particulars of the incident and the individual that's involved in that incident. And the word cloud here is just meant to really convey in a very simple way or reflect the complexity, the many stages and many variations of alternatives to incarceration across the justice system. And so thinking about the first point of decision making, we have arrest and pre-booking, and really this is thinking about or highlighting alternatives to incarceration, really alternatives to custodial arrest, so the opportunity to divert somebody at arrest from the criminal justice system entirely or from pretrial confinement. We have common mechanisms, you may be aware of these, that range from police being able to issue a warning, so they may have contact with somebody and it doesn't go any farther than a warning, to issuing a citation or a summons in which they're actually issuing a written citation with a court date for someone to appear. And really here, the key actor in the justice system, the decision-making authority, is really often law enforcement here. And depending on the nature of what's going on with the individual, there's also the opportunity for police for example, if a person is in crisis, for police to divert from jail or an emergency room to a crisis stabilization unit where an individual could be assessed and receive medical assistance as well as behavioral health services and assistance. You may be familiar, there are a number of other mechanisms and approaches at this particular stage. One that's received a lot of attention is the Seattle's Law Enforcement Assisted Diversion Program, which I believe Angela is going to be talking a little bit about a little bit later. And that really was the first pre-booking intervention in the United States. It targeted individuals with low-level drug possession charges that was indicative of use and also prostitution charges. And so there, instead of being booked and a custodial arrest time in jail, an officer could actually see if they qualified for diversion. If they did, divert that individual to a case manager who would do an assessment and link that individual to services. And depending on the position of the prosecutor, they could truly be a diversion from further entrance into the justice system, diversion from prosecution. I also wanted to draw attention to Summit County, Ohio, as a situation or a site with some innovation. So LEAD targets individuals that have particular needs, including drug offenders. Summit County actually was used or developed its felony summons program to reduce its jail population there. The county had undergone a number of budget cuts. The jail was increasingly overcrowded. One strategy that they had already taken prior to becoming an innovation fund site was to not presume that misdemeanor offenses would be taken into custody. That left them with a jail population that was 70% of their pretrial jail population were facing felony charges. So with an overcrowding situation at hand and budget cuts, the prosecutor there led an effort to design a program, a felony summons program, in which low-level individuals facing low-level felony charges could be diverted, not taken into custody and into jail, and remain in the community. They had participation from 43% of the arresting agencies in the county there. It actually was a 16-month period of time that we were looking at, not 4. They issued 749 felony summons. Of that, 72% were drug charges, and the upside of that was upwards of 70% of those individuals stayed in the community without an incident, came back to court for the processing of their case, which means that about 509 individuals who would have spent a considerable amount of time in the local jail actually were able to remain in the community, maintain jobs, maintain housing, and other critical structures that we know are important to their success in the community. So we wanted to highlight that. In terms of pretrial, post-charging decision-making here, we have the opportunity to avoid jail during the adjudication process and possibly defer prosecution as well through common mechanisms like electronic monitoring, which provides an element of accountability for someone who's facing a charge, as well as pretrial supervision, which provides a little bit more accountability in terms of linking people to some supervision and possibly services, as well as court notification, holistic defense models, and then specialty courts, which have been studied quite a bit, things like drug courts, mental health courts, veterans courts. I just wanted to highlight 2 innovative approaches in terms of Tulsa County and Deschutes County, Oregon, and what they're doing around this. Tulsa County is interesting and relatively somewhat unique in terms of using a 2-way text message system, Uptrust, in order to reduce its failure to appear rates. They knew that, again, they had a number of people who were being held pre-trial as a result of a failure to appear. It was using resources. These people could probably be productively in the community, so they implemented through the leadership of the public defender there, a 2-way text messaging app, as well as part of their holistic defense model, which features a social worker. What it does is it sends out notifications to people who have upcoming court dates, but it also allows for individuals to interact with the public defender's office and the social worker there to indicate if if they're in need of assistance. So it's really designed to remove barriers to somebody interacting with the system in a productive way. So far, it launched in late February. There were reaching about 3,700 clients on their caseload. The initial appearance rate is quite high, which suggests that when people are provided with the additional assistance that they need in order to get to court, that they will get to court and be there. And so, again, individuals who may have spent a fair amount of time pre-trial in their jail are actually able to stay in the community. And some of the Common requests so far, including for assistance, include rides, childcare, and just clarification when a defendant may have multiple court dates because they have multiple cases, and just making sure they understand which one they're showing up for so that they don't miss one. And another innovative approach is a program that Deschutes County, Oregon, collaboratively designed. It's the Clean Slate program for, again, individuals who are facing low-level drug charges, possession of a controlled substance. They found there that looking at data, it was a data-driven process, but there they found that the target population was defined after analysis indicated that approximately 400 people a year were being arrested annually on possession of controlled substance charges, and nearly 50% were recidivating or coming back into the system. So they felt like they needed to do something a little different. And this particular program offers a diversion from jail time as well as a true diversion from processing in the system. It's a 3-tier strategy that was led by the prosecutor. Again, the prosecutor brought together county law enforcement as well as the county behavioral health and primary care providers to design this program. It provides, again, people who are whose primary issue is really drug use, opportunities to link to services. The first level allows people who are facing low-level possession charges to avoid formal charges by attending an orientation, admitting to their law-breaking behavior, and then they can be diverted from any formal processing going forward. Level 2 is for people who have a really significant drug use issue and treatment need, and they can have their charges dismissed as long as they are seen by a doctor, assessed, and then are compliant with treatment over a year. And then level 3 is for folks who may have been at level 1 or level 2, had a little bit of an issue there, provides yet another opportunity for them to divert considerable time in jail by interacting with or engaging with the family drug court, and successful participation there can avoid jail time altogether. And so it's hard to see, but at the very bottom, looking at, it was only active for about 5 months prior to our work ending there, but they served 121 people. And for those who were diverted on level 1 and level 2, they had upwards of 80% who were reporting. So it was actually suggests it was quite successful. And again, people who otherwise may be spending time in a custodial setting that don't need to be. And then lastly, thinking about decision-making and sentencing and post-disposition, again, there's a number of opportunities here, and probably those that you may be much more familiar with, to employ dispositional alternatives and sentencing options to confinement, things like using, so there's the opportunity to be engaged in services through something like specialty courts, as well as intensive treatment programs. Another program I would highlight that is a true alternative to incarceration is the Tulsa's Women in Recovery program, which serves women who are convicted of low-level felony charges and would be facing significant time in state prison, but that is diverted for a period of time depending on their successful interaction with and completion of services through an intensive community-based case management program. And then you have other options like reentry programs and aftercare, as well as graduated sanctions and electronic monitoring. And again, those can be used toward the back end for people who may have served a period of time in confinement, are out in the community, but may have misbehaved, and it's a way to give them a continuum of options before sending them perhaps back to prison. So a way to avoid incarceration there. And so in summary, moving very quickly through that, there are numerous options to avoid incarceration across key decision-making points. I would say, though, that the discussion around alternatives to incarceration are also part of a larger conversation that we're having these days, really regarding the negative consequences of any justice involvement, but also thinking about what it means for people who are justice involved, to make sure we have, I think, appropriate mechanisms in place so that people aren't ushered any deeper into the system than they need to be. And while I only talked about very specific mechanisms for alternatives to incarceration, there is a movement in many communities to think about changes to penalties that require a significant or any kind of incarceration time, and also thinking about who to charge or whether to charge somebody. So we know that the many communities are rethinking that. And while I haven't touched on that, I want to make sure that I acknowledge that as well. And research, importantly, suggests that alternatives to incarceration, like LEAD and certainly specialty courts, mental health courts, and drug courts, have quite an extensive body of research that shows that they are effective, more effective than incarceration. But yet we must be mindful that there are also potentially unintended consequences in terms of net widening. Sometimes when we develop a new initiative or intervention, we like to apply it to everybody. And we should be mindful of that, which can have the negative consequence of just ushering people unintentionally deeper into the system. And again, I thank you for the opportunity to highlight a couple innovative and promising strategies that communities are testing, the ones that I mentioned. I think that part of what those underscore very quickly is just the need for collaboration across and a multidisciplinary approach. Each of the innovations that I highlighted were really the result of a multi-agency approach and people coming together to think, to troubleshoot in their community, to think about alternatives to incarceration. So, and with that.
Great. Thanks so much, Janine. And that was an information-packed presentation. We're going to get more into some of the substance during the Q&A portion. So also to the audience, get your questions ready. Next up is Angela Hawken. She's the director of the Litmus program and a professor of public policy at the Morone Institute of Urban Management at New York University. Angela?
Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to be here today. So at New York University, I also direct Beta Hub, which is an action research center, and I'll be talking about some of the work that we're doing here today. As part of that, I also direct New York University's Opioid Collaborative, which is really focused on working with primarily police and prosecutors on diversion strategies for people who are opioid involved. Just a plug for federal funding on that line. It's amazing when federal funding is available how creative people are willing to be. This is funded by the Bureau of Justice Assistance, and we have sites across the country who are clamoring to test alternatives to incarceration through that solicitation. So that's a plug for more resources, inspire more action. The work I want to do is primarily under our Beta Gov initiative, which is really kind of rapidly learning what's working and what isn't working with jurisdictions across the country. And I want to just acknowledge the practitioners who have been amazing to let us into their jurisdictions and learn with them and also fail with them. We just finished a beautiful fail forward study with Seattle Police Department. And for those of you who don't follow us, our newsletter pushes out these studies very quickly to share both what's working and most importantly, also what is not working. I'll briefly mention our domestic some of the work in our domestic portfolio, but then pivot to some of the work we're doing in international settings. Our team is really interested in those points within the criminal justice system that provide opportunities for doing something differently. We're very interested in the heavy utilizers, the people who are cycling in and out of prisons and jails and our emergency departments, looking for opportunities for what we call in-reach. Often the people who are most vulnerable never see a service provider. They just don't make it to that door. So bringing the service providers into the correction settings, into the community supervision settings to reach out to them and kind of help to drag them to feel more comfortable about entering their institutions to begin with. Often there's a fear of the unknown, and we can take that fear away. One of our more intense programs we're running right now is in Illinois called Graduated Reintegration Illinois, and I'm a recovering economist. What I noticed is that the resource allocation system is really messed up when it comes to corrections. We spend a lot of money on you today if you're in custody, but as soon as you walk free in the community, we spend next to nothing on you and then expect you to succeed, and when you don't, we just get really mad at you rather than mad at our system. So prison release for a lot of people, and most people in the United States, is $20 in a bus ticket. And for people who have been locked down for a really long time, $20 in a bus ticket just doesn't cut it. So what we managed to get the state of Illinois to do, which is quite remarkable, was to allow us to try something radically different in terms of resource allocation. So rather than release somebody with $20 and a bus ticket on release day, they allowed us to start it off with a men's facility, receive these incarcerated individuals 6 months prior to their release date. So they were still in status of prisoner, but we got to receive them in the community, but the money followed them. So what can you do when you actually have resources to help people reacclimate into the community? Powerful things can happen. So stay tuned on that project. We've been really interested in the role of new technology, and we do lots of rapid cycle testing around the role of new technology. This is often focused on staff, so we do this with law enforcement or corrections officers. How do you interact when you're encountering somebody who's in substance use crisis or mental health crisis? What are the appropriate interactions to have? And then also for our participants, how do you ready people for example, transitioning to a treatment provider in the community? If they've been down for a long time, they can experience that virtually. They can go visit their treatment provider, and that really allays the concerns of the unknown and helps get people into the front door. This is our juvenile lifer population. Can you imagine someone who went into corrections as a juvenile, right? These are 16, 17-year-olds coming out as 50-year-olds. Well, being able to experience the world virtually prior to actually doing it made for a lot of reassurance along the way. You can do job training programs. People can learn how to go to the bank or shop at a supermarket. Buying cereal is really complicated if you've been down for a long time. You just aren't used to exercising your choice muscle. Rapid cycle testing, we heard before, this idea of sending messages, getting people to show up, not just for court appearances or probation appearances, but also for service situations. And we've been doing a lot of this with people who are unhoused, as well as encouraging people to take their medication. You can really ratchet up medication adherence with antipsychotics even, with those small nudges. We have a body of work in Ohio on looking at alternatives to incarceration. And I want to give a shout out to Fred's comment earlier on. Are these meaningful alternatives, or are these just a different way of getting people trapped up in the system? What's been interesting about this work, not only are we keeping data on outcomes, we're keeping data on the perspectives of the participants. And it's fascinating under the umbrella of fairness to really hear from them about how they feel about these alternatives to incarceration. And I don't want to blow our research study, but you'd be surprised to find out which one of these lists was considered the most awful. It's not what you think it is. I want to pivot to our international portfolio. This used to be one of my favorite projects until we had a murder on our team. We were doing crime prevention through environmental design in Mexico, and the issue with the community we were working with, I love this project because of how collaborative it was. It involves the federal government, the mayor of the city in Irapuato, Mexico, as well as the private sector that was helping with data analytics. And they really approached us in a very problem data-driven way. The best way to avoid incarceration is for there not to be a criminal offense in the beginning. So they noticed that the challenge in that community was an increase in business robberies. These were, think 7-Eleven. It's 7-Eleven, right? I'm so far in right now. And a lot of these crimes were involving weapons, so these were quite serious, and it was a big issue for kind of just economic development for the town, and it was a priority for the mayor. And we stepped in and started just understanding the nature of these criminal offenses in a more detailed way, and started to notice the stores that were victimized often had many characteristics in common. They were kind of visual obstruction, so all the beer commercials and the cigarette commercials were really obscuring visibility. There was lots of litter, lots of graffiti, and alleyways were a huge predictor. So the crime prevention through environmental design was really just engaging with the business owners, getting police to think of their roles differently, engaging with the community, being in and out of those stores, helping those stores understand how they themselves could avoid victimization. So look at this tiny intervention. It's called line of sight. All they had to do was take away those cigarette ads that were in the way of the cashier, direct line of sight. We stole this from what we were learning in another site of ours in Canada. And if you can just create more visibility, you create fewer victims. Well, fewer victims, fewer crimes happening, and less incarceration. That project, unfortunately, has had a bit of a substantial setback. The person who was running our data intelligence was murdered, and our primary person had to be reallocated for safety reasons for a temporary. We're about to restart and re-engage with that project, so we are not going to be kept down for long. In Lagos, Nigeria, we were working in maximum security prison in Lagos, and it's if you've been to maximum security prison in the United States, you can know how horrible they can be. It's really, even in the US, it's often like walking into a Dickens novel. no humans. You talk about themes of humanity. You cannot believe what goes on behind bars. It's much worse in some very resource-strained countries. And in Lagos, what we were really interested in was just this idea of, can we get programming in custody settings to help prevent recidivism on the return, also to really reinforce the nature of themes of humanity in custody settings, but also in Lagos, and this is true in the United States too, people go missing. People go into custody and get lost. And I was actually in a big, well-functioning state in the US recently where someone had just gotten lost in a jail for a very long time. Well, this happens more so in international settings. So the goal was, in some developing countries, the goal was, could we just start to breed an appreciation for data? A very great pushback to corruption is the transparency that comes with data being collected around a situation. So if anybody's on an anti-corruption campaign, cannot impress upon you more. It's not fun sounding, it's not sexy, but data can be your best friend. So we worked with a nonprofit called the Joy Bringers program, and we just really started programming in custody, and really learned very quickly how difficult it was to do kind of more traditional research in that sort of setting. And we'd worked in international settings, so it wasn't surprising to us. But there was really no data infrastructure. We had to put data infrastructure into place, and there was constant churn, which made it really difficult to keep participation going in the programming that we were offering. We really had to get staff to rethink what they were doing, but it also really gave us a strong sense of the opportunities here. The staff were really willing to let us come in. They were actually really enthusiastic for it. There was like this thirst to do the right thing and to demonstrate that they were doing the right thing, and that enthusiasm, I think, has become quite infectious. We did, in the meantime, find nice improvements in at least self-reported outcomes from our program participants, but of course we'd love to get that into harder data on the re-entry experiences. Another program I'd like to plug very quickly, and I'm going to be mindful of time, so I only have a few more minutes, is, and this is something I'm really desperately trying to bring into the United States, but it's a little complicated in some of the settings we work. Some of you might be familiar with this. They're called situation tables in Canada. And we're about to launch, we're working with several situation tables in Canada, but we're about to launch the first randomized control trial test of situation tables in Barrie, Canada. And really what a situation table is, it's a strategic alliance of all of the kinds of organizations you'd think they would have to work together to really improve the outcomes of someone who is in crisis. So these are really short-term but immediate responses for people who are at acute critical need right now. So the target population for a situation table is these kind of frequent users of the system. They're in and out of multiple government systems all the time. They meet the definition of kind of an acutely elevated risk, imminent harm to self or others, and the level of need is so high that the people at the situation table deem it appropriate to share information on that individual. And that's the key that makes this complicated, is the sharing of this person's personal information. So how it works really is they have weekly meetings, and up to 32 agencies can come together without identifying the person, just as a case. No one even knows if it's a male or a female necessarily. They discuss the specific need of this individual, and together as a team they decide whether this elevates to dire need that justifies the sharing of that information. If that determination is made, only the need to know agency personnel are involved in that case. They open the veil, they know who it is, and within 24 hours they're swooping in with really an emergency response that's collaborative. In our sites where we're working, 95% of the cases coming to the situation table are referred by police, and 90% of the cases are responded to by public health. So this really is a way for them to redirect traffic in terms of individuals experiencing crisis in the community. We really have seen a taste for trying to rethink how we do both corrections and community supervision. This is a group of, we call them pracademics. We have 400 people across the US right now working with us to try something differently. And we're learning so much along the way, and we'll push out that information to all of you that are interested. And very importantly, we've been learning again how to fail forward, because so much of what we're doing just isn't working. Whether it's a big idea or a small idea, we're taking it on and trying to move the dial. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Angela. And during the a little bit later during our discussion, I want to talk more with both you and the other panelists about, you mentioned what your center does is look at what works and what doesn't, so I want to talk more about both best practices and also evidence about what is working most effectively and perhaps decision points that are least effective. But we're going to turn now to our third panelist, Jamie Jia Lee. She is the Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice Officer in the Justice Section Division for Operations at the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime.
Thanks, Zane. As she mentioned, my name is Jamie Lee. I work at the UNODC in Vienna, Austria, where we focus on criminal justice reform, and we help member states of the United Nations with a focus on developing countries and post-conflict countries on achieving criminal justice reform. And today, I want to share with you some of the good practices and also some promising practices that can have a good impact on these countries if done right with the appropriate safeguards. So my office, Justice Section, we work on 3 distinct levels. One is normative development, where we develop standards, the standard minimum rules that should be followed when a country is undergoing criminal justice reform. And in the area of alternatives to imprisonment, that applicable rule is the Tokyo Rules, the United Nations Standard Minimum Rules on Non-Custodial Measures. And this is the international community's agreement on what should be the bare minimum when you're trying to do alternatives to imprisonment. This was adopted unanimously in 1990, and it has been, our office has been widely implementing it all around the world. And that rule had been supplemented in 2006 through the Bangkok rules, which is the non-standard minimum rules for non-custodial measures for women offenders and suspects. And we also have the basic principles on the restorative justice matters in criminal matters, which governs the use of restorative justice in the criminal justice system. That's the normative level. And this is supplemented by our section's development of technical guidance materials, where we develop publications and training curriculums that helps criminal justice professionals around the world in implementing those rules, because where we unpack the minimum rules that are contained in the normative development and try to make it more understandable and accessible by countries. And the third level is technical assistance, where we use those both normative guidance materials and technical assistance materials to actually provide concrete and tangible help to the countries by conducting legislative review or capacity building exercises or training workshops, etc. So that's our office. And today I would like to share with, let me first go through the different stages of the criminal justice process to share the different good practices. First, in the pretrial stage, so in England and Wales, it's at the pretrial stage, it's really important that the imprisonment is used as a last resort, because suspects should be presumed innocent under international law. And pretrial any pre-conviction measure that imposes an obligation on the offender or the accused, consent is required. So that's the most important thing to remember when you're using non-custodial measures at the pretrial stage. And one good practice that I would like to mention is the practice of the police bail or pre-charge bail that's used extensively in England and Wales. In England and Wales, at the time of arrest, the law enforcement officers have the power to release them without being charged or with detaining them, and also impose certain conditions such as remaining at a certain address or not contacting certain people, forfeiting their passports or other identity documents, and reporting regularly to the police station. And if these conditions are not met, they can, of course, be arrested again. But practice shows that it is a good practice because it reduces unnecessary pretrial detention by a lot. In 1 year, the available statistics show that in 1 year, there was a reduction of 86% in arrestees being held in pretrial detention through this measure of police bail. But it's very important that police bail not be used in an indefinite period of time, because there's the risk of the the accused being held in legal limbo for months or even years. To combat this unintended consequence, 2 years ago in April 2017, England and Wales, they imposed a 28-day limit on the pre-charge bail so that they're not just waiting forever and not really moving on with their lives. So this really goes to show that any alternatives to imprisonment, it's really not a one-size-fits-all. It must be applied taking the nature and gravity of the offense in question, and it also can't be used for every offense, every accused. For instance, if the accused is accused of a severe domestic violence, obviously returning them to their domestic home is not a good idea. Second good practice is the use of non-monetary bail, also called personal cognizance in many countries. In many countries and through numerous studies, it's been shown just as effective as monetary bail. For example, in Costa Rica, legislation had always included the possibility of being released on personal cognizance during the pretrial stage for many decades. But and if you were to undergo a personal cognizance, in exchange of being released, the accused has to appear in court on a certain day on a regular basis, stay in a specific area, report to the and fulfill certain other conditions that had been imposed on an individual basis. And also the court obtains contact details of not only the offender but a close family member to act as a trustee to make sure that they show up to the police station or the court on designated dates. And the one thing to note about this personal cognizance scheme in Costa Rica is that failure to show up in court doesn't automatically lead to imprisonment. The second chance is usually given because there may be some situations where you just couldn't make it to the court that day or there were other emergencies. So if you were to automatically send them to imprisonment for breaking a small minor condition, that leads to the problem of net widening, which the previous panelists had mentioned about the childcare, the parenting class. So, but this was in the books. However, it was not being used very much across the country. And a team of researchers looked into why that was the case. And apparently 80% of the judges had responded to a survey that they were afraid that the suspect would just abscond and not show up. But this wasn't based on research or evaluation of what actually happened. It was just in their minds. Like they just didn't think that it would work. But according to a study done over a 6-year period, there was no difference between those who were released on monetary bail to non-monetary bail in the courts of first and second instances. The things were a little different in the third instances because third instance courts are usually not distributed all over the country. It's usually in one, like the main part of that province or state or area, so it was a little harder to implement. But in the courts of first and second instances, it is proven just as effective as monetary bail. So the key lesson here is that courts do need a complete, comprehensive access to information about the offender to know what happened that led to the commission of the crime or what would help this offender be more more prone to follow the conditions imposed and meet the objectives of non-custodial measures at pretrial stage. Another good practice at pretrial stage is the use of house arrest for women with caretaking responsibilities. The repercussions of imprisonment for women are much harsher than it is for men. This has been well documented. And although women make up a very small minority in the overall prison population all over the world, it's increasing at a faster rate than that of men. But the problem is women who come into conflict with the law are often coming from a history of victimization and substance abuse problems and mental health issues. The previous panelist has documented that well. And they often also have caretaking responsibilities of their children, of their elderly parents, or other family members who are disabled, etc. And they're often behind bars for very minor and non-violent offenses, and oftentimes prison is not a good place for them to achieve the objectives of being or rehabilitating or reintegrating to the society. And also, in addition to all these hardships, prison facilities are often designed with men in mind. And the services that are needed by women, such as for safety, for healthcare, for childcare, that's often not met within the criminal justice system. And women in conflict with the law, even after they go through imprisonment and release, they're not. They're often stigmatized and criticized for having been in contact with the criminal justice system, and they have a much harder time getting jobs afterwards or being accepted by their family members, which makes rehabilitation even more difficult. So with all these extra hardships working against them, and in recognition of this, in Brazil, in February 2018, the Supreme Court ruled that pregnant women and mothers of children under 13 and mothers of children and adults with disabilities who are in pretrial detention for nonviolent offenses should await trial under house arrest except for very exceptional circumstances. But although the measure was that could have applied to over 11,000 women, judges had ordered house arrest to only 400 women as of May 1st last year. So in over a year, they only used it for 400 women because judges made very widespread use of very exceptional cases. And this really speaks volumes about the importance of raising awareness about the benefits of alternatives to imprisonment, because even if there is a legislative or judicial measure in place, the criminal justice system it's not going to be very effective if the decision makers in the criminal justice system are not using them. So it's very important to raise awareness in both the public and within the criminal justice system to clarify the myths about using non-custodial measures and about the long and short-term benefits of using them. So similar laws are in place in Argentina and also in some countries it can also serve as a mitigating circumstance if the woman is living in poverty or have other child care caretaking responsibilities, or have elder people or disabled family members. Or in Armenia, if you're pregnant at the time of sentencing, it can serve as a mitigating circumstance as well. So another good practice at the pretrial stage is a restorative justice measure called the victim offender mediation. First, a little note about restorative justice. It's both a process within the conventional criminal justice system, as well as a paradigm shift in criminal justice. As a process within the conventional system, it describes any process that brings victim and the offender and other affected members of the community and society together to talk about what happened and to reach a resolution on what to do about what happened. And the conventional criminal justice system usually only deals with crime by applying the law and identifying who's to blame and then administering punishment. It focuses on punishment, denunciation, retribution, and deterrence. On the other hand, restorative justice views crime as essentially having inflicted harm on the individual and the community and the society, rather than just violating the law that's in place. So its focus is to repair the harm that was caused. It's a fundamentally different approach to looking at crime. And it also tends to addressing the needs of the people that are involved, not just the offenders and the society. And it's also the only measure that brings victims into play in the criminal justice system. In conventional criminal justice, victims are basically incidental to what happened, even though they're the ones that are most affected by the crime. Their role is usually limited to providing evidence, or in certain jurisdictions they can give victim impact statements, but it doesn't really it doesn't have a determining power in disposition of the case. Whereas in restorative justice, victims' needs and their role is at the center of it all, and it's the only measure in the current conventional criminal justice systems around the world that really gives the voice and a stake to the victims. And for this reason, and for many other benefits of restorative justice, if used well and if used in the right context with the appropriate safeguards, can serve as a really promising practice to achieve the goals of criminal justice without really excluding anyone. And victim-offender mediation, sometimes called the victim-offender dialogue, reconciliation, or conferencing, is another good example. It's a good example of this. It emerged in the 70s in North America and in Europe, mostly in Scandinavian countries, and it's currently the most common form of restorative justice that exists within the criminal justice system today. It's important to note, though, that if it's called mediation, but it's very fundamentally different from mediation in other areas, such as civil or in commercial mediation. In victim offender mediation, the process usually starts with separate meetings with the victim and the offender to assess the suitability of the case to mediation, and to ensure that the offender is willing to take on the blame, which is different from admitting guilt. And these preliminary meetings are followed by joint meetings where each party has the opportunity to describe what happened, their feelings, and how it impacted them in their lives, hear their stories, and talk about how to what could possibly address the harm for them, or what they want to do from here on out. And after one or a series of these meetings, the parties reach an agreement, which can include material compensation, an apology, restitution, or other services for the victim, and they reach this agreement. And if the restorative justice measure is used as a diversion from prosecution, it often goes back to the prosecutor or the judge who ordered it to inform them about what happened, and this is what they agreed to do. And instead, the offender doesn't have to go through the regular criminal justice process. And all the mediation can be used at any stage of the criminal justice process, but it's most often used at the pretrial stage as a diversion from prosecution. But I also want to mention that not every case is well fit for restorative justice, especially in cases involving gender-based violence, for example, domestic violence or sexual violence. Restorative justice, use of victim offender mediation and other restorative justice measures should be applied very carefully with the appropriate safeguards really in place and at the prime of it all, at the center of it all. For domestic violence in particular, there's almost always a power imbalance between the offender and the victim, and the risk of re-victimization and secondary victimization is exceptionally high. It's not something that can be observed right at the first meeting, but that has been going on for a long time, and usually it's hard to detect at first glance. And in cases such as these, the importance of appropriate screening and risk assessment is extremely important. And this risk assessment should be done on a continual basis and not only in the beginning. Facilitators, the mediators need to be very well trained in the dynamics of power and control of the domestic violence, the history of domestic violence and intimate partner violence. And a good practice in this area is Austria. Their probation and mediation agency called Neustart, which means New Start. In Austria, probation office handles victim offender mediation in addition to probation. And in cases involving gender-based violence, there's always a very long and careful risk assessment process to see if the case is well suited for mediation. And if it goes forward, there's always two mediators, one for the offender and one for the victim, and of the same gender. And facilitators are always very well trained on intimate partner violence and sexual violence. And initial training spans over 2 years with practical training and ongoing the mentorship as well. And as far as use of restorative justice and gender-based violence goes, this is one of the practices that we can highlight. So at the trial and sentencing stage, I want to talk about the use of suspended sentences and fines, which is very well done in Germany. The suspended sentence is a prison sentence that's not immediately put into effect, but may be later, but delayed. So in the 70s, Germany, then West Germany, they changed their penal code and reduce the use of imprisonment by maximizing the use of fines and suspended sentences. First, prison sentences of less than 1 month were abolished altogether and replaced with fines. And second, a lot of petty offenses were decriminalized and made into administrative sanctions. And third, laws were changed to discourage prison sentences of less than 6 months by requiring courts to provide a specific reason why they're putting them into jail instead of giving suspended sentences. And a combination of these measures brought about a massive reduction in sentences, imprisonment sentences. Between 1968 and 1996, there was a 70% reduction. And nowadays, prison sentences are rarely used in Germany. It only constitutes 5% of cases that are imposed by the court that comes into contact with the criminal justice system. And suspended sentences are almost always, they're always given with a precondition that you don't commit any new or the same crime, and generally accompanied by more conditions such as compensation to the victim or the charitable organization of their choice, regularly reporting to the police, avoiding contact with certain people, usually victims, and undergoing treatment and rehabilitation. And of course, if there is a new offense or if any of these conditions are seriously violated, they can always serve the original sentence that were given. And this requirement to provide an explanation for imprisonment is particularly effective, because it doesn't cost anything. It's a very simple measure that makes judges actually think about, why is it that we have to give imprisonment when that actually has cost, and cost to the society and on the individual and on the family members, when in fact it can be suspended, and see if the person will behave afterwards. And this has been the efficiency of this measure has been demonstrated in Kazakhstan as well. They implemented the same measure in 2001, and it has led to prison sentences from 50% of all sentences to only 42% in 2002. So it can be effective in low-income countries as well. And one thing to mention here is also Germany made very good use of fines by introducing day fines, which is basically it's a proportionate amount of fine instead of an absolute amount. So what you pay as a fine is proportional to what you make. And this was used very widely in Germany and applied to more than 80% of all criminal cases. And it has showed, and a lot of the studies that were done in Germany since then showed that they were more effective than probation and imprisonment in terms of reconviction rates. And it showed that day fines increased the rate of payment as well. Since the introduction of fine, only 4% defaulted on the payment of fines because they were able to pay them. They were much less than what you would have paid if it weren't for day fines. But there were also, I should mention that there were some studies that were done that the day fines don't work as well if you don't have a good formula in place that allows the judges to reach the same amount of fines, no matter if it's the same nature and gravity of the offense. So that's an important thing to keep in mind if you're going to use that measure effectively. So in the interest of time, I'm going to move on to the post-sentencing stage. At the post-sentencing stage, the objectives are a little different, right? The person has already been convicted. They already are serving part of the sentence. The main objective here is for rehabilitation and reintegration into society. And Japan has a long history of doing community-based probation, which the main part of that is the use of volunteer probation officers, VPOs, who are private citizens that have regular jobs. They're normal people that assist the professional probation officers by being a sort of a mentor to the offender. They have official status of a part-time government employee. They're not paid at all. They're reimbursed for certain expenses, but they often have the status of a part-time government official, and it works like this. If the probationer or parolee is first referred to the volunteer probation officer by the professional probation officer, and then they meet regularly. They share information, advise, and then the volunteer probation officer gives advice and makes observations on how well they're integrating into the system until probation is over. And it's generally the overall objective of this program is so that the newly released offender has a way to has someone they can rely on to reintegrate into society, because oftentimes, and in many countries around the world, when they are released from prison, it's like a giant sign that they can't get jobs, they can't find housing, they can't, there are a lot of things they can't do or are a very, very difficult position to do that compared to a normal person. And the volunteer probation officer is designated as a person who can help with that. And since they're volunteers, they really want they want to do this. They're passionate about it. They're actually have the time and the resources to help them. So it's been proven very effective. Japan, of course, is one of the safest countries in the world. I mean, there's a chicken or the egg problem, but it has been very effective in Japan. There are almost 50,000 volunteer probation officers in Japan. They help about 1,100 professional probation officers. And you can imagine how cost-effective it must be for Japan to have volunteers to do something that full-time probation officers would be doing in other countries, but more effectively and more efficiently. I think I have one more, but let's move on, and then I can talk about it later also.
Great. Well, thank you all for the overview, and I think we've covered a lot of ground here, and the three of you have given a wealth of examples from different jurisdictions, not just within the U.S., but around the world, which, is fascinating because in many respects, what happens to you depends in large part on where you are arrested and where you are prosecuted, both in the world and in the United States. And just for context, we have over 3,000 counties in the United States alone. And as I said, in large part, what happens to you will depend on whether you're arrested in, say, New York City versus Tulsa, Oklahoma. What the Vera Institute has found is that over the last 10 to 15 years, jurisdictions in large cities in particular have been implementing justice reforms that have drastically reduced their rate of jail incarceration. But at the same time, in rural counties, which as many people probably have heard in the United States, are struggling in terms of resources, in terms of the opioid crisis. But even prior to the opioid crisis, they began locking up their citizens at higher and higher rates, and they have huge increases in jail incarceration. So given that so much depends on the jurisdiction, I want to sort of turn to the macro level, and for the three of you in both your research and in practice, have you found that there are decision points in the criminal justice system that are more effective for these interventions, and also are there decision points that are less effective for intervention?
I guess I'm an optimist. I don't think there is a bad intervention point. I think we have to think of them all as an opportunity. In our work, if I think about, I call it them the 20-minute studies, where within 20 minutes we can have the most impact, and that's usually bringing a data scientist to look at an issue, has been with prosecution. Just showing them their own data has a very powerful effect. Whether it's addressing race-ethnic disparities, whether it's addressing issues of over-incarceration, just letting them understand their caseloads. So for me, that's a very powerful opportunity to intervene. I think we've been very lucky in recent history in the US that we do have prosecutors increasingly open to considering alternatives, and this is in blue states, red states, purple states, and all the states in between, that we really are at this moment of potential change in the country when it comes to prosecution. So I think there's a lot of promise right there.
I don't think it's. I don't think there's a certain stage in the criminal justice system where alternatives are the most effective, because as I mentioned, the objectives of using alternatives at different stages are a little bit different. And I think what's more important than the timing of it is to have to impose an alternative that is well suited for the offender or the accused. You have to make sure that it fits the nature and gravity of the offense, and the personality and the background of the offender. Say, for instance, if it's the use of victim offender mediation, it has to be someone who is willing to go through the process of meeting someone and talking about what happened. You can't just impose a mediation if they're not willing to do that. So it's important to tailor what kind of offense that you're going to do. And on the flip side of that is that it's important to have a wide range of alternatives available, right? Like you can't impose the right one if there aren't a lot of options to choose from, and that this is what we see a lot of in developing countries, where they have something that started, like a new program that started, and they start using it a lot for all different types of offenses, but that's not very effective. It has to be well tailored for the offender, and also about on what the type of crime.
And just adding to that, I think building on both points, it's important for also the stakeholders in a community to be aligned in terms of what the objective is, and understanding that. And I think a lot has to do with implementation around that, and having good buy-in around the objectives, again, of what that looks like. So I think a lot of times you look at implementation, and that's where there can be a level of when something isn't working. It's because it hasn't been fully implemented, or perhaps implemented with fidelity. Everybody's not quite sure at the table around what this means, or how it's supposed to work, or why we're doing this. I think that's foundational.
And, jumping off that point and the implementation, and Jamie mentioned the sort of desire to have a one-size-fits-all approach, which, as you mentioned, doesn't work. I think the challenge that probably you all have heard, that we often hear, is we lack resources to implement anything. And then when jurisdictions do want to implement something, it does end up being some sort of shortcut for reform, which doesn't work so well. I know, obviously, a lot of countries are struggling with lack of resources. Can you all speak to the resource question when jurisdictions say, hey, we'd love to implement some kind of alternatives, we just don't have, the ability to invest in either the research or the resources to do that? What is your response to that? Does anyone have a response?
More money is needed. No, I think in general, we starting with a conversation, and every place is different, and even if something is done with high fidelity, the importance of place can't be underestimated. We've seen exactly the same program implemented in a jurisdiction Y. They got completely different outcomes, and just feels different because of local players just being different. The culture is different, the atmosphere is different within those agencies. Often agencies actually have more than they think they do. So often it really is an exercise in reallocating existing resources or reprioritizing from an initial budget. And that's where I think it is helpful to have one, if not an economist, but someone who thinks in terms of resource allocations and where can you find the dollars that you need to do what you really need to do. And they almost always can come up with something that's reasonable. And if what they're doing is successful, they can grow it from there, right? Because there will be the savings on, if this is working and we don't have that recidivism flow back in, eventually those savings will create their own futures. So I think that we don't have resources. We don't actually really let that be an excuse. I think someone used the language of excuse earlier. I think it was Pam. It really is an excuse to not get started. And I think if you put them on the spot for that, and recognizing that every jurisdiction can do something to make the next right step happen, they almost always come on board.
And I think there's a similarity there with thinking about data too, and starting small. That often communities have more data sometimes than they may realize. What they may not have is the analytic capacity to look at that and think about what it's telling you. So I know we often try to work with communities to say, let's start small with what you have. Let's see what you have and what kinds of questions that raise about what else we need to know and how can we help you build that capacity so that you can use your data to inform what you're doing or monitor what you're doing to see if you're on the right path and achieving the outcomes, and if not, why not?
Availability of resources is extremely important for alternatives to imprisonment, because one of the rationales for one of them, for using alternatives to imprisonment, it is more cost effective than imprisonment. Prison is extremely expensive, and alternatives, if it can achieve the same objectives with spending a lot less money. So it's actually a very, very attractive thing that governments should be doing. However, I think that the PR of alternatives is not very good, and that's where that's the weak link, I think, in this area, that of a very negative perception of letting prisoners off the hook kind of image. So raising awareness in both the public and within the criminal justice system, I think, is one of the most important things to improve the resource situation that we're seeing in pretty much all of the countries around the world. And although there are non-custodial measures that you can implement with very minimal investments, a lot of them, and to be effective and to be used appropriately, they do need certain amount of front-heavy investments that the governments need to do. And for that to work well, I think governments need to have the political will to divert more to have more fund, to set aside more funding for use of alternatives. So raising awareness about the benefits and the rationales of alternatives to imprisonment should be at the forefront of this any kind of policy surrounding alternatives.
And I'm going to agree with you there. In the United States, what we've seen is often it's the law enforcement agencies that are some of the biggest opponents to changing anything in terms of the way sentencing schemes work, in terms of changing who's charged and who's not. And that goes, I think, to the political problem, because no politician wants to sort of stand in opposition to law enforcement agencies. Before I turn it over to the audience for their questions, I want to ask you all one last question from me, which is, what is the one sort of critical piece of information or research that you feel like is lacking in this area that you would like to see?
I think we've really understudied fairness more generally. I think we tend to create programs for ourselves. We think about ourselves, and if I was, wanting to encourage myself to behave differently, what would I do to myself? And well, I'm not facing a felony conviction anytime soon, most likely. And so creating programs for ourselves, even though it seems right to us, it seems appropriate, often when I think leaning in and really listening to the populations we're serving well, and really thinking through fairness carefully, and how to have a criminal justice system that does not itself create harm. And that opens up a very big conversation and a complicated conversation. And I think the issue of fairness is given short shrift.
Either of you want to answer that question?
I agree. I mean, I think that's right. And I guess also thinking about procedural as part of fairness, I guess procedural justice too, and thinking about how the experience of people who are walking through the system, and thinking how that strikes them, and thinking about making sure that even these alternatives are employed fairly but consistently, and that people understand that. And I think there's a lot that we take for granted sometimes. You hear people who are going through the system, even with something like a court notification, the perception can be sometimes from stakeholders that it's just someone's recalcitrant, when really this just isn't good information about how this process works or what's expected of them. And when you make that clear or make those resources available, and I think we just sometimes may not fully appreciate that as much, but we're taking that into our research as well.
Okay, so we're going to, I think, end at 12:40 in order to get time for folks to walk down for lunch. But I want to open it now to the audience for any questions. Yes, in the back.
Henry Hecker, retired government. I wondered what your feelings were on ISIS women and families that have recently come to light in Syria. We had one individual, a woman who will not be able to re-enter the United States. Her citizenship has been revoked. There's a number of ISIS families right here in our own country, or people at least had some connection to ISIS. What is their status? Do you think people ought to be put on probation, be able to return here, or find a country that will take them, where they might be accepted and can be reformed? What are the plans, and what do you ladies think about it?
Well, let's have an easy question before lunch, shall we? Honestly, that's a hugely challenging question. And if I had a well-informed opinion on it, I'd love to share it with you. I just don't, and I think I'd be we're not a credible voice to address that now. Would love to think about it some more, take a card and get back to you. But I just honestly don't have a well-informed. It's such a complicated issue. I think it would be a disservice for me to respond.
Anyone else want to take that very easy question? Any other questions from the audience? Yes.
Are any of you currently in joint ventures using both foundation funds as well as public funds to promote and stimulate change within local communities?
So I can answer that question from Vera. So we receive a fair amount of foundation funding to work with local jurisdictions directly. Oftentimes it's with the stakeholders. So we're working, for example, in the MacArthur Safety and Justice Challenge with several counties to reduce the size of their jail populations. We have other work going on that's looking at the rural incarceration growth that I mentioned, and that is looking at sort of the problem more holistically, looking at the community, what are the community stakeholders, and then also who are sort of the official government stakeholders, and figuring out from the folks on the ground, what do they see as the challenges, and how can we get people to start working together, folks inside and outside of government. I think that's sort of a key next step for our work. I think was there a question back there?
There was some discussion at the very end related to public relations. I work in Malawi. Part of our program does community sensitization, but it's very limited in scope. I mean, with a view, at least for me, to a developing country context, what work is done related to community sensitization about the purpose of punishment and the purpose of the incarceration versus other methods of responding to what we as society deem as improper actions or activity.
Okay, great question. Who wants to take that first?
I'll,
I didn't know I wanted to talk about it from an international perspective.
Go ahead. We all still have each other. Go ahead.
Well,
Go.
So I think that's an interesting question. I feel like here part of it is, I guess I would reframe that as kind of community education in part, thinking about, and again, I think sometimes we take for granted that people may understand the purpose of the criminal justice system or how it works. And I think we find often in our research that there are a lot of misconceptions from the community at large, as well as sometimes stakeholders within the system who just know their part. So a lot of that is around education. I think we also, as we sometimes do large public opinion polls, we realize that the larger public is much more ready to embrace things that are fair, equitable, and make sense, that aren't so punitive. But I think you're right, it's kind of an education campaign more broadly, and thinking about how you get that out there and how you're working with stakeholders more broadly, I think, to embrace that or understand that.
It's great. I would add to that. There really is. I mean, we have a problem with numeracy in general. This is not just in the United States, but in general. And when it comes to criminal justice, there's serious innumeracy issues. The public just doesn't really understand the basics of where we are at in terms of criminal activity. Most people think crime is up when it is not. There's a strong lag between what's actually happening and how people perceive it to be happening. So really, I think just valuing that the public is able to learn and getting information out, and then creating. I love this this language of these deliberative forums, these kind of deliberative democracy forums where issues are really brought to people, where sometimes you really have to know quite a bit about an issue to even get to the point of making an informed opinion, and recognizing people are able to be sponges if presented with the right sorts of information and kind of grow an understanding of an issue in that way. And there's some great work out of Stanford on that sort of deliberative conversation.
I think we have time for one last question. Yes, right there in the back.
Yes, my name's Rob Bowman. I'm with the U.S. Department of Justice. Thank you. And I'm the Regional Director for Africa. And first of all, I want to thank the panelists, both panels, for presentations, and most importantly, the important work you guys are doing, because I think not only in the United States, but particularly abroad, this issue is paramount. In Africa, the stats that we have is 40 to 80% of the people incarcerated presently are pretrial, that is, waiting adjudication. What I've been arguing for a number of years is this is the preeminent human rights concern in Africa. It doesn't get as much attention as any of the explosive things that happen in Africa, tortures, incarcerating press, and so forth and so on. But it is the most widespread, I think, human rights abuse. And it's ignored largely because the system continues to grind on. So the types of things you guys are discussing here, I think, are very important. I want to make just one observation that perhaps in answer to your question, you had a couple of questions about where in the system is the most efficacious, when in the system is it most efficacious to intercede? And you also had the question about resources. My argument to INL and to the CT Bureau, to State Department, the government, and my argument, I think, to you colleagues here who are working in this area, and particularly overseas, is the most efficacious place to intercede is at the front end. We spend an awful lot of effort at the back end, and that becomes much more problematic for all the reasons you all have discussed this morning. It's much more expensive because you have that many more people incarcerated. And most importantly, of course, the front end, you're incarcerating people who don't need to be there in the first place. And the stats with regard to the 40 to 80% of the people incarcerated pre-trial, what we know is that the majority of them should not be there in the first place, not meaning that they shouldn't be diverted, but they shouldn't be there because the evidence is not there. And so I think that the USG and its activities, and so I make this observation to people working in this field, because I continue to make this observation to my colleagues at State Department in terms of the programs, that we should put much more emphasis on the front end, including the criminal procedure, including evidence-based decision-making by, and some of this has been alluded to, of course, already, evidence-based decisions by the police, by the prosecutors, giving them the discretion to make decisions at the front end, and then all the way up to plea agreements, which again have been alluded to. We get a lot of grief for advocating plea agreement regimes overseas. The U.S. seems to, we get a lot of grief from the international partners that this is problematic. If you work in Africa, you recognize that plea agreements are a very beneficial part of any kind of regime to reduce that pretrial detention. So I think in answer to the questions you asked the panel and to follow up on that, just from my own observations, we really need to emphasize in the work we do and in advocating to our USG partners who's giving us the money, rather, as I say to people, in the systems, particularly in Africa, I know less about Latin America and other places, you can throw a dart in the criminal justice system and you're going to hit something that needs work, particularly on the prison context. And if you've been in any of the prisons in Africa or any other developing countries, you know how horrific they are. So your immediate reaction is, we need to put more effort here. And that's true, we shouldn't ignore that, but we need to continue to emphasize the front end. And the last point I'll make on that is, and the point I make to my colleagues is, with regard to resources, one, the USG knows how to do this, and number two, it is an area which can be zero cost or low cost interventions of the types you've all alluded to here this morning and gone into detail about. Whereas many of the other things you've talked about, including the back end with case management, those things are impossible or at least improbable in places like Africa. As a consequence, we should be implementing and demonstrating to them the very low-cost solutions at the front end so we don't have so many problems at the back end. That's my observation for comment.
Really helpful observation. Does anyone want to offer any feedback or comment before I close this out? Okay, great. So I just want to end. I'll just end here and say Vera put out a report recently that found that every day in the United States, a person is arrested every 3 seconds. The United States is a very large country, but someone is arrested every 3 seconds. That's a whole lot of people that are being arrested, and the vast majority of those people are arrested for nonviolent, non-serious offenses that most people would agree are nonviolent and non-serious. And so we've got a problem, as the last person mentioned, about dealing with things at the front end. And at Vera, what we talk about is how we treat people in the criminal justice system is often a reflection of our values, both at the local level, the state level, and the national level. And so in order to implement some of the changes that our panelists talked about, a jurisdiction has to be willing to sort of shift how they see people in the system and sort of shift that value structure, which I think goes to sort of the larger question that we talked about here, is looking at sort of the political will and changing public hearts and minds. So that's sort of the larger project that all of us are a part of. But thank you so much for your participation, and thanks so much to the organizers for organizing this panel.